What if I told you a $15 billion oil deal might be the bullet that kills Western dominance in Africa? In the blazing heat of New Delhi, as cameras flashed and dignitaries smiled, two hands met across polished mahogany. One belonged to Narendra Modi, leader of 1.4 billion people, a rising global superpower. The other to a 36-year-old soldier from a landlocked, war-torn country most Americans cannot place on a map. And yet, when those hands shook, the ground beneath the old world trembled. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso didn't just sign a contract, he lit a match and tossed it into the fuel tank of global geopolitics. $15 billion. No IMF, no World Bank, no Western banks involved. Oil in exchange for steel mills, power plants, petrochemical hubs, and weapons factories, all built in Africa by Africans, with Indian capital. If that sounds like business, think again. It's revolution disguised in paperwork. Because for the first time in modern African history, a poor country didn't beg, it bargained. And the West, it wasn't even invited. So ask yourself, is this partnership a new beginning or a Trojan horse wrapped in silk and rupees? Can a forgotten nation like Burkina Faso actually tilt the balance of power between East and West? What you are about to discover is not a headline. It's a message, a warning, a blueprint. Because this pact is not just about barrels of oil. It's about who writes Africa's future and who gets left behind in the past. If you were in Traoré's boots, would you trade danger for dignity? Would you sign, or would you run? Stay with us, because the next 10 minutes may change how you see Africa, the dollar, and your place in a world no longer ruled by the familiar hands. What exactly did Traoré sign, and why is the West panicking? They didn't see it coming until it was already signed. While Washington obsessed over Russia, while Paris whispered about China's advances in the Sahel, a move far more disruptive was unfolding quietly. In New Delhi, under the flashes of cameras, Burkina Faso's young leader, Ibrahim Traoré, put pen to paper beside Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The ink was barely dry when the tremors began to ripple through the corridors of power. This wasn't aid. This wasn't a loan. This wasn't another IMF contract dressed in polite words but poisoned at the core. What Traoré signed was a $15 billion deal split across 6 critical sectors, each one designed not to beg, but to build. The first strike, $4 billion for oil extraction and refining. For decades, Africa has drilled crude and shipped it away while importing back refined fuel at inflated prices. That cycle ends here. The deal calls for construction of refineries inside Burkina Faso. Oil will no longer leave the ground only to enrich someone else. It will be processed at home by Burkinabe engineers, creating jobs and keeping value within the country. The second strike, $5 billion into petrochemicals and energy infrastructure. Think pipelines across dry plains, storage facilities, export terminals, but also domestic grids. For the first time, the power produced will not only leave for India, but flow into Burkinabe villages where darkness has been normal for generations. This is not just fuel, it is light, dignity, and economic ignition. The third strike, $3 billion in steel and manufacturing. New foundries and industrial zones will rise. Steel is the backbone of modern economies, rails, bridges, tractors, and machines. For Burkina Faso, it means moving from a raw exporter to a builder, from selling ore to shaping nations. The fourth strike, $2 billion in defense technology. This is the line that rattled Paris and Washington most. The pact does not focus on buying weapons. It focuses on producing them inside Burkina Faso, assembly lines for rifles, workshops for armored vehicles, communications gear designed and tested by Burkina Faso youth. For decades, security was rented, dependent on outsiders. Now, sovereignty grows fangs. The Fifth Strike, $1 billion in agriculture, telecom, and training programs. A small number compared to oil and steel, but perhaps the sharpest blade of all. Because it invests in the next generation, coders, engineers, farmers with modern tools, technicians in telecommunications, the battlefield of the future is not just in deserts with guns, it is in classrooms and digital networks. The sixth unspoken strike, currency. Though not in the official document, insiders confirm India and Burkina Faso are quietly exploring non-dollar settlements. Oil sold in rupees. Technology purchased without passing through Western banks. If realized, this bypasses the dollar and euro stranglehold, a silent revolution against financial empires that assumed their currencies were eternal. Now, let us pause, because this is where excitement turns into danger. Every line in this contract threatens established power. India secures vital energy and influence in West Africa without the burden of colonial guilt. Burkina Faso secures the tools of industrialization the West never gave. On paper, it is a partnership of equals. But here's the question. Is this bold strategy or reckless defiance? If the factories rise, if jobs are created, if light bulbs flicker on across rural Burkina Faso, this becomes a blueprint for post-Western African development. And then the real panic begins, not in Ouagadougou, but in Washington, Paris, and Brussels. Because if one small landlocked nation can break the cycle of dependency, others will follow. Mali, Niger, Chad. Even larger economies like Ethiopia or the Democratic Republic of Congo will take note. The West can contain one rebel, maybe two, but an entire continent. That is a nightmare scenario for the old order. This is why analysts in Europe whisper the same fear. If this is the new Africa, we are not ready. So what exactly did Traoré sign? He signed more than a contract. He signed a warning shot. A declaration, a gamble that Burkina Faso will not be a pawn, but a player. And the world is holding its breath to see if that gamble explodes or ignites a revolution. Why did the West panic after Traoré's $15 billion deal? When the cameras dimmed in New Delhi, the real storm began. Western diplomats called emergency meetings. Analysts in Paris spoke of a seismic threat to stability. Washington think tanks rushed out memos warning of a new axis between Africa and Asia. And yet, behind closed doors, the whispers carried the same emotion, fear. Because this deal was not just about barrels of oil or billions of dollars. It was about the audacity of a young African leader telling the old order, "We will not kneel." In Ouagadougou, the signing was greeted with thunderous cheers. Crowds filled markets and streets, waving flags, chanting Traoré's name. For a people long used to broken promises, this was not just another contract. It felt like a crack in the wall of dependency. Mothers spoke of electricity finally reaching their villages. Young men saw the possibility of steady work in factories instead of risking their lives crossing deserts toward Europe. For once, hope did not come in the language of aid, but in the language of industry. But abroad, the reactions were far colder. France, the former colonial master, was stunned. For decades, its grip on West Africa rested on two levers, the CFA franc and exclusive energy access. Traoré's pact struck at both. French newspapers warned of strategic isolation. Military officials worried that India's defense partnership could sideline French arms sales. And the unspoken truth, if Burkina Faso succeeds, France's influence across the Sahel may collapse like a domino chain. The United States watched with sharper suspicion, not because of oil. Burkina Faso's reserves are small compared to the Middle East, but because of precedent. If a small, landlocked country can bypass the dollar, what stops Nigeria, South Africa, or Egypt from doing the same? Pentagon officials whispered about strategic drift, while State Department voices cautioned that India's rise in Africa could reshape alliances for decades. Washington doesn't fear losing barrels. It fears losing control. China, surprisingly, reacted with careful silence. Beijing has poured hundreds of billions into Africa, but often on terms that sparked resentment, debt traps, accusations of exploitation. Now, India offers a different model: investment without bases, factories instead of loans. For African leaders frustrated with China's heavy hand, Traoré's deal looked like a tempting alternative. China's silence was not indifference, it was calculation. And across Africa, the ripple was immediate. Mali's leadership praised the pact openly. Niger's junta hinted at similar discussions. Ghanaian economists debated whether this could mark the dawn of an African-Asian industrial alliance. For once, the conversation was not about dependence, but about choice. Yet, alongside celebration, shadows grew. Critics asked, can India deliver on promises so vast? Can Burkina Faso absorb such investment without corruption swallowing it whole? History offers grim warnings. Billions have flowed into Africa before, only to vanish into offshore accounts and half-built projects. Will this time be different, or will it be another betrayal painted in bright colors? The stakes are clear. If Traoré fails, he risks not only his own reputation, but the credibility of a whole movement. The West will say, "We told you so." Africa cannot govern itself. But if he succeeds, even partially, the world will have to reckon with a new reality. Africa choosing its partners, writing its own deals, shaping its own destiny. So here we stand, at the edge of two futures. In one, the West reasserts control. Traoré is undermined, and Burkina Faso becomes another cautionary tale. In the other, the pact holds. Factories rise, and a spark of sovereignty spreads across the continent. Which future will emerge? That depends not just on contracts or capitals, but on people. On Burkinabe farmers who demand fair electricity, on workers who refuse corruption, on citizens who refuse to let this moment slip into history as another dream deferred. And that is why the world watches in silence. Not because Burkina Faso is small, but because the idea it represents is enormous. So ask yourself, do you believe this pact marks the rebirth of Africa, or just the calm before another betrayal? Will this $15 billion pact save Burkina Faso or destroy it from within? For decades, contracts in Africa have lived and died on paper. Big promises, flashy numbers, smiling leaders, and then silence. The people saw nothing. The lights stayed off. The jobs never came. That is the battlefield Traoré now faces, because a $15 billion deal means nothing unless it reaches the farmer, the factory worker, the student in the classroom. And that is where the true consequences will unfold. Civil consequences first. If even half of the promises materialize, Burkina Faso could see transformations once thought impossible. Imagine villages that have known only kerosene lamps suddenly glowing with electricity. Imagine young men who once looked north toward Europe now entering training centers for steelworking, coding, and telecommunications. Imagine markets buzzing with goods made in Burkina Faso, not just imported from abroad. That is the best-case scenario: jobs in steel mills, positions in petrochemical plants, salaries for engineers, opportunities for welders, dignity for farmers with modern equipment. It could create a new middle class in a country where most survive on subsistence. For a landlocked nation long written off, it could mean rebirth. But every coin has two sides. The dark scenario is equally vivid. Factories built, but owned entirely by foreigners. Jobs reserved for imported workers. Technology transfer promised, but never delivered. Profits flowing out of Burkina Faso as quickly as oil flows east. In that case, the deal would be no revolution at all, just a shinier version of the same old exploitation. The people would feel betrayed. Anger would rise. And what began as hope could end in protests, unrest, even blood. And then, there is the question of politics. At home, Traoré has raised expectations to levels no leader can easily satisfy. By painting this pact as a liberation, he has tied his legitimacy to its success. If villages remain dark, if unemployment stays high, his support could evaporate faster than the billions invested. And in a country already scarred by coups and insurgencies, political failure is not a slow decline, it is collapse. Abroad, the political stakes are just as dangerous. France will not watch its influence die quietly. Already, whispers spread of covert funding for opposition groups, of media campaigns sowing doubt, of intelligence operations aiming to destabilize the regime. The United States, too, has tools, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, pressure in international forums. If the pact weakens Western leverage, the pushback will not be gentle. And let us not forget the insurgencies. Armed groups, some with foreign backing, thrive on instability. A stronger Burkina Faso with local weapons production threatens their lifeline. Will they simply sit idle? Or will we see an escalation of violence aimed at choking this experiment before it bears fruit? Still, the consequences are not only threats, they are also opportunities. If Traoré manages transparency, public contracts, visible progress, direct benefits for ordinary citizens, he could build something far more powerful than steel plants: trust. The trust of a people long denied it. And with that trust, politics could transform, no longer the cycle of coups and collapses, but the birth of a government rooted in sovereignty, defended by citizens who believe their future is being built, not stolen. But make no mistake, this deal is not a miracle. It is a gamble. Every worker hired strengthens Traoré's position. Every promise broken weakens it. The battlefield is not just in New Delhi or Washington. It is in the streets of Ouagadougou, in the farms of Kaya, in the classrooms of Bobo Dioulasso. So the question lingers, heavy and unavoidable. Will this $15 billion pact lift Burkina Faso into a new age, or bury it under the same old chains, polished to look new? The U's and the world's view. When word of Traoré's $15 billion pact hit Washington, the first question wasn't about oil, it was about precedent. Because the United States knows one truth: once a pattern is set, others will follow. If Burkina Faso can sign a massive deal without the IMF, without the dollar, without Western oversight, then what stops Nigeria, Egypt, or South Africa from doing the same? That is the nightmare lurking in think tanks along the Potomac. For Washington, the concern isn't barrels, it's blueprints. If a tiny, landlocked nation can shake the chains of dependency, it plants the idea that others can too. Ideas are harder to contain than armies. Already, American analysts speak of strategic drift. They see India stepping into Africa, not with military bases or lectures on democracy, but with factories and partnerships. And that cuts directly into America's brand. For decades, UL influence in Africa rested on aid packages, military training, and soft power through institutions. Traoré's deal points to a future where aid is irrelevant, where partnerships are chosen outside Washington's reach. So what will America do? Diplomats will pressure, Congress will threaten sanctions, media outlets will highlight corruption risks, and behind the curtain, intelligence agencies may quietly look for ways to destabilize the experiment. None of this is certain, but history suggests the U.S. rarely watches quietly when influence is at stake. In Paris, the shock runs deeper. France once saw West Africa as its backyard, a zone of guaranteed influence. That illusion is cracking. With the CFA franc questioned, with Indian capital building factories, France faces the unthinkable, becoming irrelevant in its former empire. French media already describe the pact as a dangerous precedent. Military officers whisper that if Burkina Faso arms itself with Indian-made rifles, French weapons sales across the Sahel could collapse. For Paris, this isn't just about business. It's about identity. A once mighty colonial power reduced to an outsider. In Brussels, the European Union worries about energy politics. If African nations diversify partnerships, Europe loses leverage. Sanctions, trade deals, even climate agreements could lose their bite. One EU diplomat admitted anonymously, if Africa stops listening to Europe, our influence ends. In Beijing, the reaction is muted but calculating. China has spent decades buying African loyalty with infrastructure and loans. Now, India arrives with a model that looks cleaner: equity, co-ownership, factories, not debt. For many African leaders frustrated with Chinese strings, Traoré's deal is a tempting alternative. Beijing's silence isn't comfort, it's unease. And across the global south, the pact is hailed as a beacon. Leaders in Latin America and Southeast Asia watch closely. Could similar partnerships free them from Western leverage? Could this be the start of a broader non-Western alliance system? The stakes are enormous. For the West, failure would reinforce control. Africa tried and failed again. But success rewrites the map of influence. So here lies the question for America, for Europe, for China, for the entire order built after World War II. If Africa no longer plays by their rules, how long can those rules survive? The road ahead. Every great gamble has two futures, one bright, one dark, and the ink Traoré placed on that $15 billion pact has opened both paths before Burkina Faso. In the bright future, the pact delivers. Factories rise from the dust. Thousands of jobs appear in steel, petrochemicals, and defense. Electricity hums through villages that have never known it. Farmers plant with modern tools. Students code software that links Africa to Asia. Engineers design machines built not in Paris or Beijing, but in Ouagadougou. In 5 years, Burkina Faso could stand as a hub, not just of resources, but of industries. A bridge between Africa and India, between past dependency and future sovereignty. In the dark future, the script is familiar. Contracts mismanaged. Profits vanish overseas. Factories controlled by foreign bosses, while locals remain cheap labor. Promises of training fade, leaving only dependency dressed in new colors. Corruption seeps in like poison, draining billions into offshore accounts. The people grow angry, protests spread, and the pact collapses into the graveyard of African dreams. Another story told as proof that independence is a myth. Which path will prevail? That depends less on India, less on the West, and more on the Burkinabe themselves. Because this is not just a contract, it is a test of governance. A test of transparency. A test of whether a people long denied power can seize it without squandering it. Traoré may have signed the paper, but the real signature must come from the citizens, in their discipline, their vigilance, their refusal to let corruption steal the moment. And the world is watching, not just neighbors in Mali or Niger, but leaders in Latin America, Asia, and beyond. If Burkina Faso succeeds, it lights a fire across the global south, proof that partnership can replace dependency, that sovereignty can be built, not borrowed. If it fails, skeptics in Washington, Paris, and Brussels will say, "See, Africa cannot stand alone." So here is the road ahead, not a straight line, but a battlefield of choices. Every project completed, every factory opened, every light switched on will either build the future or betray it. And that leaves us with the question, will Burkina Faso walk boldly into a new century or stumble back into the shadows of the old one? Did Burkina Faso just sign its liberation or its doom? History does not forgive wasted chances. And in that room in New Delhi, when Ibrahim Traoré placed his signature beside Narendra Modi's, it was more than ink on paper. It was a gamble written across generations. $15 billion. Oil, steel, power grids, factories, weapons, training, agriculture. It is not just a contract. It is an architecture of sovereignty, a blueprint of what Burkina Faso and Africa could become if dependency is broken and dignity is reclaimed. But let us be clear, this is not destiny. It is discipline. If the projects are built, if jobs are created, if technology is truly transferred, then this pact will be remembered as the spark of Africa's awakening. Burkina Faso will stand not as a beggar, but as a partner, not as a pawn, but as a player. And generations will say, this was the moment we rose. But if corruption poisons it, if profits vanish abroad, if the pact collapses into mismanagement and broken promises, then history will not be kind. Burkina Faso will not only be judged as a failure, it will be used as a weapon against the entire continent. Western voices will laugh. See, Africa cannot stand on its own, and the chain of dependency will tighten again. That is the razor's edge. Traoré walks today. Victory or ruin, rebirth or betrayal. And now, the question is not for him alone. It is for every Burkinabe farmer demanding light for his fields, every worker demanding fair wages in the factory, every citizen demanding transparency from their leaders. Because this pact is not just signed in India, it is signed in the lives of millions. And so, I leave you with this question. If power is finally in African hands, will they use it or lose it? If you were in Traoré's seat, would you choose safety or sovereignty? Would you risk everything for freedom? The cameras have already captured the handshake. The ink has already dried. But the story is still unwritten. And now, my friends, I ask you, do you believe Burkina Faso just signed its liberation or its downfall?